Well, thank you so much, Meta. I mean, between my having left my lecture notes in my office and having to run across campus to get them and not having updated my website for a while, yeah, I'm not looking very much on my game, but I'm really looking forward to our discussion this evening. And I really want to thank you, Meta, for including me in this fabulous series that you put on that I've admired from too much of a distance for a long time. You really do important work in stimulating debate, conversation about the most important issues that we confront. And so, chapeau. And thank you so much for including me in the series. So the lecture I'm going to give tonight is really, the background is, what I've been thinking about in recent years is democracy under conditions of globalization. How do the changing political and economic structures that brought by globalization transform both the way we understand and the prospects for democracy in the future? And so I've been thinking about those questions for a while now, but have had to rethink quite a lot over the last year or so. I'd say that you know, since the Brexit vote and the vote for Trump last year, we democratic theorists, I think, are in a state of existential confusion. Everything we thought we knew about democracy is thrown into question by these events, by these major disruptions. So what I've been trying to do, and last year I had the privilege of spending the year in the company of a lot of people who think about democracy all the time at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at the Kennedy School at Harvard. And I was struck then by how many of my colleagues there were in as much a state of confusion and distress as I was. At least I was in good company. And I can't say that I have come to any earth-shattering realizations over this last year about how we make sense of what is happening. And so really what I'm trying to do in this lecture is just to piece together the elements that I think we need to be thinking about in order to understand what's happening to contemporary democracy globally, what's happening in particular in Western democracy, and the rise of right-wing populism is clearly one of the things that is on our minds. But how these changes in our democracies, these crises of contemporary democracy, are linked to underlying features of globalization. So a lot of what I have done here is really just to piece together in what I hope is a more or less coherent picture the work that particularly economists have been doing, trying to make sense of, especially of inequality and the structure of inequality as it has evolved during the period of globalization, and how that links up to domestic processes of democracy. So you know, I've put the title of the lecture in a declaratory form, just saying the crisis of democracy, which presupposes that there is a crisis of democracy. So is democracy in crisis? And I think that, well, implicitly my answer is yes. But that to arrive at that answer, we have to begin with a proper understanding of what we mean by crisis, and to be specific as well about what we mean by democracy. I think in this group it will be unsurprising to say that elections alone don't make a democracy. Democracy requires a wider complex of institutions and social conditions. So the democracy I have in mind in this conversation, this lecture, is constitutional democracy as a regime. And here I have in mind Aristotle's concept of politeia, which is a complex system of both institutions and social conditions and social relations that make up the character of a political order. So democracy as the regime by which territorially bounded states are governed is, I think, at a turning point, a crisis, because the social conditions that support democracy as that sort of regime are under strain. The crisis of democracy is a transnational phenomenon because the change in these social conditions arises from globalization. That's a claim that I'm making. It may be controversial. I invite challenges and questions. The rise of ethno-nationalist populism in Western democracies, I'll argue, is not the cause of the crisis of contemporary democracy, but its symptom. I think the underlying cause of the crisis is the increase in domestic inequality that has resulted from globalization, and the particular structure that this inequality has taken, which is especially about the hollowing out of the middle class. The global character of the crisis of national democracy generates a number of paradoxes in how we understand what's happening, and I'm going to highlight 5 such paradoxes. So first, just to define some terms, crisis. We get the word crisis from the ancient Greeks, who used it in both political and medical contexts to denote a situation where a complex system, a political order, a human body, is at risk of collapse or death. So a crisis marks a turning point and a moment of judgment and decision, a moment when action or intervention is required to turn the situation from disorder and potential collapse toward renewed stability or health. So I've given you the Oxford English Dictionary definition, or one of its definitions, which is the one that's salient for the way in which I'm using the term. A vitally important or decisive stage in the progress of anything, a turning point, also a state of affairs in which decisive change for better or worse is imminent, now applied especially to times of difficulty, insecurity, and suspense in politics or commerce. So by crisis, I don't mean that the end of democracy is nigh. I mean that we are at a critical turning point and decision point. And so the challenge for us is to think about what kinds of decisions or judgments we need to be making, and whether or not there are interventions that we can make that might turn things around for democracy. So I'm using crisis in that sense. Democracy, it's good to go back to the Greek there too. Demos kratos, the people. Some people use the word rule to translate kratos or kratia. Josiah Ober has a new book out. He's a scholar of classical Greek thought, and particularly the Athenian democracy. And he gives it a different emphasis, a different reading, emphasizing that the kratos means exercising power. It's exercising power, which isn't the same thing necessarily as ruling, that is, issuing commands that must be obeyed. It's the exercising of power together by the people. The international idea, which is a really important research consortium that studies democracy around the world, from theoretical questions down to very nitty-gritty institutional questions like ballot design, electoral systems, and so on. And they use this working definition of democracy: popular control over decision makers and political equality of those who exercise that control. So I would really stress the political equality as central to what we mean by democracy. Now, this broad definition of democracy still doesn't tell us too much, though. I think that here I'm also drawing on IDEA's recent report on the state of global democracy, or the global state of democracy, I think they call it. And I think this is a really useful diagram, visualization of the complexity of the democracy that we have in mind. Again, thinking about democracy as a complex set of institutions, again, supported by social conditions and cultural commitments that work together to sustain an overarching political order. And what I think this brings out is that, so what we have in mind is not simply democracy as contrasted with authoritarianism, as though there's a stark binary distinction between democracy and authoritarianism, though in the history of the tradition of political science, that's often been the way democracy has been understood, fairly narrowly in terms of the presence or absence of competitive elections. This is a more complex and nuanced picture. adding this complexity that democracy requires a complex set of institutions which include elections for sure, but also include an independent judiciary, free media, an independent or impartial civil service, certainly the protection of fundamental rights, as well as some elements of participation and so on. Adding this more complex view to democracy, some people would call it liberal democracy. I prefer the term constitutional democracy because I think the term liberal is a bit loaded in ways that we might not want to embrace. But constitutional democracy understood as a balance of these institutional structure, a complex whose integrity needs to be actively sustained. That's what I have in mind by democracy. And once we understand democracy in that way, then there's not a binary distinction between democracy and authoritarianism. Instead, it becomes more of a continuum, the degree of the presence or absence of each of these different pieces of the democratic regime. And that then enables us to see that, whereas in the history of political science on transitions from authoritarianism to democracy, there's, again, tended to be this binary distinction between authoritarianism and democracy. And an assumption that political change has, based on the experience of the 20th century, been moving from authoritarianism toward democracy, and there's a sort of built-in supposition that change is going to be pro-democratic. When you add this complexity in the picture, you can see that actually change can go either way, and it's a matter of degree. There isn't a bright line boundary that you cross from being an authoritarian regime to becoming democratic, or in de-democratization. There's not a bright line that you cross in switching from being a democracy to becoming an authoritarian regime. And my colleague Lucan Ahmed Way in political science here, together with his co-author Steve Levitsky at Harvard, have added a new element to the classical regime taxonomy, which they call competitive authoritarianism, which are authoritarian regimes in which political decision-making power is centralized, concentrated in a few hands, but those hands are legitimated through popular election. And so that's, I think, a very useful concept for getting us to see that the change or transitions from democracy may not look like a switch to a clearly authoritarian regime such as Kim Jong-un's North Korea, but rather a competitive authoritarian regime such as now Turkey has become. It used to be more democratic, it's clearly less democratic, and it's tipped over the edge into competitive authoritarianism, whose legitimacy still rests on popular elections, but the conditions under which, the institutional conditions under which those elections are held, are now radically changed by the decisions of this popularly elected leader. So is democracy in this sense as a regime in crisis? And I think the answer is yes, but again, in the proper sense of the term crisis. It's not that democracy's demise is imminent or inevitable, but that it's at a turning point, a moment when decision and choice is required to tip the scales in favor of the patient's survival. I think it's important when we have to be careful of our own tendencies to fear and alarmism as well. It's important to bear in mind that in the big picture, democracy as a regime type is not in imminent danger of disappearing from the map of the world. This is also, again, from IDEA, and it shows both the number of democracies, so you can see the percentage of states which are electoral democracies, and also in these bar graphs, the percentage of the global population that is living under an electoral democracy. And you can see, if you look at the tail of the curves at the top, you can see there's been a bit of a downturn. But nonetheless, over the span of, this starts in '76, the last 40 years, that there has been an increase both in the number of democracies and the percentage of the world population living under democracies. And so when we start feeling alarmed and panicked about what's happening in Western democracies, we have to make sure to put it in this larger perspective, that democracy is not in imminent danger of disappearing, but it is showing signs of stress as a regime type that is prevalent.
What are the two colored lines?
So
at the top. What?
yeah, the blue one is just the percentage of, it's just a linear representation of the bar graph. So it's the percentage of people, of the global population living under democracies, in electoral democracies.
Percentage of global and percentage.
So the purple line is the number of states that are electoral democracies. All that just means is that there are a number of smaller than average states that are democratic and some large states, such as China, that are non-democratic. So there are some signs of worry that emerge here, if I'm taking as a presupposition, which we can also discuss, that democracy is a desirable regime type as contrasted with its alternatives. So there are signs for worry here at the end of that distribution. There are other signs of worry. So Freedom House, which is a fairly centrist organization that tracks the level of freedoms in countries around the world over time, has found, using its indices that it's been using for decades now, that yes, there has been some decline in basic freedoms measured globally in recent years. Here's another index. This is the Economist Intelligence Unit Democracy Index, which, like the idea understanding of democracy, uses a complex measure. I think they have 60-some different metrics that go into their index to measure the state of democracy around the world. And so in this you can see that it includes a spectrum. One of the good things about this index is it doesn't have a stark binary between democracy and authoritarianism. It reflects that there's a spectrum, that there's a continuum. And what is, and according to their index, there has been democratic backsliding across the board in recent years. This particular graphic doesn't show that, but it does show, I took a screenshot of the, you can do a scroll down and look at it country by country, whether Canada, as you can see, is one of the few really healthy democracies or full democracies. There are only a handful of countries that are full democracies. What this shows is that in 2016, the United States, which had been a full democracy for a long, long time, slipped a notch and is now no longer regarded as a full democracy using this index. Now, that coincides with Trump's election last year, but it's important to recognize that it's not that this loss in status on the democracy index isn't because of Trump's election. It reflects, again, a shift in these measures, and in particular, it's an artifact of the measures that track trust in government. So Americans' trust in their government has been declining steadily, and it's declined enough that that was sufficient to make the difference between whether or not the U.S. came out as a full democracy in that metric.
The color scheme is kind of confusing.
Pardon?
The color scheme is confusing. On the one side, authoritarian regime is dark brown, and the full democracy is also dark brown.
Oh, well, it doesn't, it's actually a dark green. The full democracy is green, but it's a very dark green, so yeah, it is confusing, but that may be an artifact more of my computer's color pattern than anything else. Okay, so one of the reasons why we might think that democracy is in crisis as a regime type is, as I've already suggested, the rise of populist movements and parties and leaders around the world, which has certainly seen an uptick in recent years. Now, populism isn't synonymous with the crisis of democracy, I think. This is, again, my tentative judgment based on the pieces I've been trying to put together, but rather a signal that a crisis exists. I'm going to stick with the medical metaphors. I think we can see populism as a symptom or a complication of a systemic disorder of democracy, but one that can itself prove fatal, just as pneumonia can be fatal for someone who has an immune deficiency. That ethno-nationalist populism or right-wing populism, you may use those terms interchangeably, that right-wing populism is on the rise in Europe and North America these days is indisputable. Whether it's Trumpism in the US, or Brexit, or Le Pen, or AfD in Germany, or Viktor Orban in Hungary, or the march of 60,000 white nationalists in Poland, just in case you want to get some of that alarmism and panic back into your system, just a couple of weeks ago. We can also look beyond Western democracies, not very far beyond, to Erdogan in Turkey, to Modi in India, to Duterte in the Philippines. Ethno-nationalist populism is not confined to Europe, nor should we ignore the left-wing populism that's more characteristic of Latin America, such as Chavismo in Venezuela. So this is the first paradox of the 5 that I want to highlight. That is that rising nationalist populism, that is a kind of populism that claims the popular sovereignty of the people as nation within a territorially bounded state. So nationalist populism is a transnational phenomenon, and that generates a puzzle. I think what it signals is that the crisis of democracy also has a transnational structure and logic. Now, before turning to that, let me just get another definitional point out of the way. Let's just talk for a moment about what populism is. And here I'm following Jan Werner Müller's definition in his recent book titled What is Populism, which I highly recommend. It's very readable. And he argues that populism has 2 jointly necessary features. The first is anti-elitism, and the second is anti-pluralism. Now, the anti-pluralism, well, both are tied up in the idea of populism as a representation of a unitary, pure, good people against a corrupt or predatory elite. The feature of anti-pluralism is really crucial for distinguishing between genuinely populist movements from other kinds of democratic movements that are also critical of elites. So what is anti-pluralism about? So we can think first just what are some of the other democratic movements that are very critical of elites. So we can think of Occupy or Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn or Podemos in Spain. These are all leftist movements which definitely invoke ideas of the people, but they're not unitary in the sense that the right-wing nationalist populist movements are. That is to say, the crucial difference is that populists claim to represent this morally pure, unitary people, and to draw determinate boundaries around that people, so that anyone who doesn't conform to their idea of who the people are is excluded from the status of having a claim to free and equal citizenship in a shared democracy. And so if we look at these other particular leftist movements, which is not to say that populism can't have a leftist form, but these particular leftist movements that I've talked about don't have that structure. That is, they're not claiming to exclude from citizenship those who don't conform to their idea of what or who the people are. This exclusionary logic is the key reason why populism is inimical to democracy, which depends on a willingness among citizens to share a society with one another. So I think that's really important to emphasize that anti-pluralism as part of the definition of populism. And this is a mistake we often see even among quite sophisticated social scientists, and I think it bears pushing against again and again. We'll hear people talk about Occupy or Sanders as populist. And I think this is a definitional error that we have to push against, because it's this exclusionary logic that makes populism. Now, a third factor that we can associate with populism is a diminishing faith in democracy as a regime type, and an increasing openness to the authoritarian rule of strong leaders, strongman politics. We're seeing a lot of that around the world these days. And here I'm just, again, cribbing from the work of Foa and Yasha Monk, who have been tracking. This represents a tracking of a survey question that's been asked in many surveys for quite a few years now. The question is posed in this way. It asks respondents to agree or disagree with the statement, quote, "A strong leader who does not have to bother with parliament or elections is a good way to run the country." And so this is a rather alarming thing. If we look again, I think the colors may not be coming out very clearly, but you can see that's a lighter blue, that's a darker blue. The lighter blue is the more recent period, 2010 to 14. The darker blue is earlier period. So this shows the change, in the direction of change. So here what we see is that there's been a growth in the United States in the number of people who agree with this statement. So the increasing tolerance for authoritarianism. And again, I apologize for the poor color. You can see that this increase has been, very strong. Say in South Africa, that's quite a big increase there. Now, it's not uniform. So there are some countries in which things have gone the other direction. So there's less of tolerance for authoritarianism in Pakistan, for example. But in Germany, there's been an increase. Thankfully, in Canada, it's declined and is low relative. So Canada is around here, so lower than most other of the countries studied here. Canada has a number of blessings when it comes to the crisis of democracy, which maybe I haven't addressed in the text of my lecture. Maybe we can come back to that in the discussion. So this is a third factor, this increasing tolerance for authoritarianism and an increasing or diminishing faith in democracy as some social scientists put it, the only game in town. Democracy is no longer the only game in town, even for a growing number of citizens in even quite stable, historically stable democracies. Now, so why is democracy a threat to, why is populism a threat to democracy? Well, it's because once populist leaders get into power, they follow a fairly standard playbook of de-democratization. And we've seen this play out in Turkey. We're seeing it play out in Poland. We're certainly seeing Trump trying to play it out. He's been meeting some institutional resistance. The constitutional regime of democracy in the United States has been more resilient than some may have feared so far, touch wood. But the standard playbook is basically that leaders use the legitimacy they gain from having been elected to systematically skew that complex institutional order in their own favor. So they hollow out their career civil service, or they stack it with their cronies. They weaken or stack the judiciary. They strengthen the executive branch relative to the legislative branch, which has also been happening even in quite strong democracies over recent years. They limit media freedoms. They neutralize opposition. Depending on how far toward authoritarianism they've gone, they do that by peaceful means, by co-optation, or they do it by having people bumped off, as in Russia. And importantly, they also rewrite the rules of the electoral game so that the next time there's an election, they'll win, and then get again that legitimacy that elections deliver. So those are fairly classic steps by which democracies turn into competitive authoritarian regimes. Hungary is a case where we've seen a lot of this happen in just the last few years. It's happening in Poland, and we can see Modi doing some of these things. We certainly see everyone doing these things, step by step. So what causes populism? So that's why populism is a threat to democracy. It is an existential threat once it gets into power. What's causing the rise in ethno-nationalist populism? There are two main causal accounts that are circulating in among social scientists these days. Both are tied to globalization. One focuses on rising cultural anxiety that is a consequence of the increase in immigration that is associated with increasing labor mobility as well as heightened refugee flows over recent years. The other is that rising inequality, and in particular the declining fortunes of the industrial working class in Western democracies, has produced deep economic anxiety that creates ripe conditions for anti-elite sentiment. I think I'm probably not saying anything that comes as a surprise. It's not original. I'm not really claiming to say too much that's original in this talk, just trying to put things together in as clear a picture as I can. So these two accounts focus on the demand side of populism. That is, what is it that makes citizens ripe for recruitment into populist movements? There's also a supply side of populist narratives that channel this underlying anxiety into political anger toward targeted elites. And in contexts where immigration is high, people who are feeling squeezed economically can be mobilized to turn their anger not necessarily toward elites, but toward the immigrants and minorities, as well as the elites who are positioned in these narratives as supporting the well-being of these now out groups over the well-being of the working class. These are characteristic forms of right-wing populism as they have been unfolding in Western democracies. In other contexts, such as Latin America, the anti-immigrant narrative is less available for elites to mobilize. And so political anger is directed instead against economic and political elites, particularly those who are in Washington or in New York or in the global centers of power. But in either case, the elites that are targeted are characterized as globalist and as part of a conspiracy of some sort to wrest wealth and power from the people. Now, one thing I think it's important to bear in mind is that, in fact, there's nothing deeply irrational about this anger that's directed toward elites. Because across most Western democracies during the period of globalization, say from the early 90s at least until now, it's actually true that the working class and the lower middle class have been the losers of the policies that have sped the process of globalization. This is the famous elephant curve by Branko Milanovic, an economist who published a book this last year called on global inequality. And it's a very clever data visualization of the patterns of income, the distribution of growth over the period of globalization. And so I don't have here the years that are reflected in this, but it's, I think, basically from, the early 80s through the mid 2010s. And this is a global, these are global figures. And what you can see is that there has been a gain. So this was a period of immense economic growth, and this graph reflects how that growth was distributed across different income groups in the global population. And so what you can see is that those who are at the bottom of the distribution actually gained quite a lot during this period. You know, up to the 50th percentile, they were mostly gaining. But then things start taking a downward turn. And so this band here, the bottom of the trunk of the elephant, represents the middle classes in advanced democracies or advanced economies, including Western democracies. And so this is just and then you can see that the people at the top, the rich got significantly richer, as we all know, during this period. So now it's important to recognize that on average, even this middle income group in Western democracies did gain, on average, a bit through this period. And so I think this is important because it draws our attention to relative gains and losses. And then leads our attention to go to questions of gains and losses in status and not simply in income, which is really important when we go back to that idea of democracy as political equality and as sharing a society together on terms of equality. So relative status loss is a significant issue, I think, as I'm understanding what we're seeing. And so here's a second paradox, though, that globally we can see that this period of globalization brought a somewhat reduced inequality across individuals globally. So inequality globally actually diminished during this.
0, 20, 40, 60, 80.
That is, I think that's the percentage growth in income. Percentage growth in income.
If this is an elephant, then,
Yeah.
then I guess the trunk of the elephant is on the right-hand side.
Yeah, yeah, that's the trunk.
Very small trunk though.
Yeah, that's the trunk. And I'm not an economist, so I am sort of, there's been a lot of debate about this, and as around some of the other data that I'll be presenting, there has been debate, but the economists like Joseph Stiglitz and Danny Roderick and others, who like Milanovic, I think Thomas Piketty as well, he tracks the growth of inequality globally over a longer stretch of time. And they're all basically convergent on the core points, which are that inequality within countries has grown dramatically, even though, and this is the second paradox, even though globally, across individuals and across countries, inequality has diminished. So there's a kind of paradox there. You can have a reduction in global inequality at the same time that there's an increase within each country of inequality. So that's the second paradox. And we can understand this if we look at something, that in particular the two big countries that have benefited tremendously from globalization, China and India, very populous countries. And if you just think about the tens of millions of people in those countries who have been lifted out of extreme poverty because of the growth in production and trade, then that helps to explain a whole lot of this graph. And so we can see in those two countries too, even though there's been an increase in GDP, substantial increase in GDP, inequality has also been increasing in those countries. But it's been increasing in pretty much every country. All right, so now I'm getting a little short on time, so I'm going to skip the mechanisms that link globalization to, actually I have a slide, so I'll just go through it very quickly. That link globalization. What are the mechanisms whereby globalization, that is economic globalization, increase in trade, combined with financial globalization, the ease of financial flows across borders. What are the mechanisms by which these two features of globalization, increased trade and financial globalization, generate growing domestic inequality? There are a few. So one is that trade generates domestic losers, and here, it's really, just think of those hollowed out cities in the Midwest that used to make automobiles or other things whose jobs have been shipped to Mexico or China, as Trump is constantly reminding us. Well, those are cases where trade generated domestic losers who were not really compensated. Even though there's usually in trade agreements, there's some nominal provision for the compensation to the losers of increased trade. In fact, those compensations very seldom add up to very much. So that's one factor driving inequality, domestic inequality during globalization. The second is technological change, which in principle doesn't have anything to do with globalization. Technological change has its own logic and it's proceeding everywhere. But it turns out to be very difficult to disaggregate from trade. So increasing technological development, which displaces labor, has accelerated at the same time as trade has increased. And that technological development would then it puts people out of work because it reduces the need for labor inputs in production. And financial globalization, I think, is really important and maybe one of the areas where we have the most capacities for intervention at the same time that, because how are we going to intervene in technological development? Closing down trade is something that Trump talks up a lot, and certainly we're going to see in Britain whether Brexit reduces the total amount of trade and what the impact of that is on the economy. But our economies have now become so dependent on trade. A growing percentage of GDP derives from trade over this period, and so to give up on trade means giving up on a lot of income, and that's not going to be politically saleable. So technological change is going to be difficult. You can't turn back technology. Financial globalization generates inequality through a couple of different mechanisms, and here I'm relying on a recent paper by Danny Roderick, which goes through these mechanisms in more detail. But the key things that we can see fairly clearly are that the tax burden shifts from capital to labor under conditions of globalization and financial globalization, because capital can move across borders. Capital is more fluid. It's hard to catch. There's a colleague, Peter Deitch, at the University of Montreal, who wrote a book recently called Catching Capital, which is a great title. It's about the international tax regime and the difficulty of actually capturing the gains, all of these economic gains, because of the financial instruments that have been developed and the ease of capital mobility across borders. The integration of the global financial system makes it very easy for money to move around. Labor can't move, so labor is easier to tax. It stays put more than capital does. We can see this as well through the tax havens revealed by the Paradise Papers and the Panama Papers, through which people use create these corporate entities in which it's easy to hide their wealth. So that's one way in which potential tax revenues escape the clutches of the governments that then could use them to either for redistributive programs or for infrastructure projects, both of which have redistributive or have a tempering effect on inequality. Another mechanism that Roderick points to, which I think is also really important, is that increasing financial mobility increases economic volatility, which increases the risk of economic shocks, which then creates economic crises, which then produce austerity programs, which we certainly saw in Europe during the Euro crisis. And this also can be an instrument used by ideological elites who have anyway an interest in austerity programs for shrinking the size of government, so the kind of libertarian, or what's called neoliberal ideological agenda is made easier when there are shocks to the economic system. So austerity, it has an anti-redistributive impact. It takes away those supports that secure social or interclass mobility from the working class to more advantaged
What about inflation?
positions. Pardon?
Inflation.
Yeah, well, I think inflation hasn't been high, and I'm not an economist, but inflation has been quite low through this period. Yeah, so inflation hasn't, I think, had an effect during this period. All right, so in making sense of the relationship between globalization, inequality, and democracy, I think it's really important to emphasize this middle class structure of the inequality that's been increasing. And this is the third paradox, that in many contexts, poverty has declined while inequality has increased. What that means is that the worst off members of society have in many places, including Canada, including the United States, including the UK, made modest gains in income, while the middle class has stagnated or lost ground, and the upper income tiers have gained dramatically. In short, the working class, again, if we use these graphs that show, here I'm not going to get into this, this is a very complicated diagram that I would like to unpack because I think it's quite revealing. But if we did, oh, shoot, what did I just do? Oh, okay. Okay, I just did something. Anyway.
Where is that?
Where are you taking this?
Looks like Yosemite.
Oh, sure.
It is.
This one, yes.
Yeah, I'll just do that. Okay, well,
Okay, a project, this project, no project. A
All right.
project,
okay.
and then, oh, this.
All right. Well, it's not crucial. I can just describe it for you. But basically, many studies of income change break the income groups into 5 quintiles, 20% blocks of the population. So the pattern that we can observe, it's very clear in the American case through this period, is that the lowest income quintile gained. The second and third income quintiles either gained very little or lost. The fourth income quintile grew a bit. The fifth income quintile grew a lot. And so these two, the second and third income quintiles, lost, relatively speaking, in 2 directions simultaneously. They lost relative to the worst off, who were making forward progress while they were backsliding. And they lost relative to the best off. And so they are experiencing declining or downward social mobility and increasing obstacles to upward social mobility. So the gap between the most advantaged and the middle is getting wider and wider, and more people in the middle are sliding toward the bottom. And that structure, of course, it varies from one country to the next. It turns a lot on redistributive schemes and taxation schemes, which vary a lot across countries. But that basic pattern certainly is in place in the United States, and we see it in other places too, including Canada, which makes Canada's relative resilience on the right-wing populist front interesting and worth thinking about. But if we want to understand the anger that drives populist movements and undermines democracy, I think it's really crucial to pay attention to that particular structure of inequality, because I think a lot of us are really accustomed to thinking about inequality through the lens of, or from the perspective of, the worst off members of society. And from that standpoint, inequality is definitely bad for democracy because it unjustly excludes the worst off citizens from full participation as equal members of society. And that's a very compelling moral position, I think, especially in societies, which are all societies, where there is intergenerational poverty. So if democracy is about political equality, notwithstanding the existence of economic inequality, then we have to constantly be paying attention to whether or not those who are in the worst off positions economically are still enjoying access to political equality of some sort. But what these new patterns of inequality enable us to see is something that we've known intellectually, at least since Aristotle, but haven't been paying much attention to lately, I think, which is that the stability of democracy depends on the belief of the middle class that it benefits from the overarching political arrangement. Now, there's a dark side to these empirical patterns as well, because the structure of domestic inequality that's emerged in Western democracies during this period creates an opportunity for working class anger to be directed not only toward the best off, who've been the biggest gainers, but also toward the worst off. The worst off are still the worst off, but they've made marginal gains, and for members of the working class who have experienced this downward mobility, these gains for the poorest can make them an object of resentment, especially if the gains seem to result from redistributive programs that disproportionately benefit minorities and immigrants and are funded through tax systems that are still drawing from the working class. So you add cultural anxiety to the mix, and what you get is a toxic brew of resentment that is ripe for being mobilized into ethno-nationalist populism. So to sum that up, I think in understanding right-wing or ethno-nationalist populism, we have to pay attention to the ways in which economic anxieties combine with cultural anxieties to produce working class anger toward immigrants and minorities as outgroups, as well as toward political and economic elites. And I think this class has experienced a three-pronged relative status loss during this period. I've already mentioned they've lost status relative to the best off, the hope for upward mobility is shriveled, and they've lost status relative to the poor because some among the poor are gaining ground while they're losing ground. And so here we can also look to what some economists and psychologists together have been researching, they call last place aversion, showing that the desire not to be at the bottom of a social distribution is a strong enough motivation that people will actually oppose gains for those just below them in the social system, in the system of distribution, even if they themselves will benefit from that redistribution. They don't want to risk being in last place. And this resonates, I think we've talked a little bit about Arlie Hochschild's deep story that she tells in her book on the working class whites in Louisiana, strangers in our own country. She has this narrative that she reconstructs from her interviews that talks about their feeling of the unfairness of the system, that they keep seeing these people who were behind cutting in ahead of them in the climb up the social ladder. And that interacts with racial, which have been actively mobilized, racial anxieties and hostilities to create supply for right-wing populism. And this is the third prong of the relative status loss on the cultural front, which is this even darker side. And we can't ignore the racial and gender dimension of these populist movements, which are predominantly middle class and working class, but white working class, and especially white male working class. And I think that's ugly, but we can't ignore it. And I think that it makes sense if we think about it in terms of relative status gains and losses, because over these last decades, women and minorities have made hard-won gains in education and employment, whereas working class men have lost relative status on that front. And so if we think about it that way, then it's understandable that they resent what they may experience as women and minorities cutting in line ahead of them in a social system in which they were supposed to be the kind of bedrock status group, or the core of the the enfranchised class. That is not those who are going to rule, but those who get to choose who's going to rule. And if they start seeing themselves as displaced by these other groups, then their anger is not justifiable, but it is understandable. So I've painted a pretty dismal picture of the rise of ethno-nationalist populism, and I think that dismal character is fitting because where it gains power, it threatens constitutional democracy. And even where it doesn't gain power, it has an immediate negative impact on human rights by stimulating hate crimes against those who are designated as othered. We've seen a lot of that in recent months too. It's a very dark force. But the anger that these movements express toward elites is not only understandable, it's justifiable. Over the last several decades, elites, whether center-right or center-left, really have turned a blind eye to growing inequality and to the declining fortunes of the middle class. So if our patient democracy survives this crisis, though, and here's a fourth paradox. If our patient democracy survives this crisis, populism might turn out to have a bit of a silver lining. That is, a chastening of political elites to address domestic inequality, creates an incentive for them to wake up and pay attention and try to do something about this phenomenon. And without the middle class, you don't have resilient democracy. And so this is the paradox here is that in small doses, a bit of populism might trigger a response that might move the system in the direction of health, much as a vaccine uses a weak strain of a virus to trigger an immune response. That's kind of optimistic, and it's putting a bit more of a bright side on what is a dark force. But what's crucial here, as elites begin to contemplate this possibility of responding to the structure of middle class inequality, is that those responses must not come at the expense of the worst off members of society, neither the poor nor minorities, because to stabilize democracy at the price of injustice would not be a moral gain. But there's a key challenge here, which is that the condition that generates the crisis of democracy, globalization, also constrains government's capacity to address the problem of middle class inequality. So if we take the example of tax avoidance and tax competition, the OECD estimates that tax avoidance costs governments about $240 billion a year in lost revenues. Tax competition between states generates a race to the bottom, from which almost every government actually loses. I see your expression, so let's vocalize that I'm almost done. Tax avoidance through tax havens compounds the problem. So these features of the global tax system have an enormous impact on domestic inequality by increasing shifting the tax burdens to the middle and working class and away from corporations, and by depleting public coffers of the resources governments could spend on redistribution and infrastructure and other things that mitigate inequality. Now there's finally some movement in addressing these taxation issues in the OECD and in the EU, which is putting some sanctions on Ireland for its very, very low tax rates and its sweetheart deal with Apple. But we'll see how far those get. I know we should be a little skeptical that they're going to be the salvation because economic elites are going to continue to lobby hard to keep governments, keep the pressure on governments to keep those tax rates low. And meanwhile, until there is a domestic constituency that's actively mobilizing around progressive tax reform, they're not facing strong counterbalancing pressures politically. And so there's a little bit of room for hope, I think, in some transnational movements that have taken form around tax justice. You can think of the Robin Hood tax movement. There's Canadians for Tax Fairness. there are a number of organizations, and they are quite networked, and they are using these networks to put pressure on national governments to, for example, stem tax competition. And that's the fifth and final paradox, that transnational democratic movements may play an important role in strengthening national democracy by generating the pressures that generate the reforms that strengthen the middle class position and future. So let me just sum up, and I'm going to conclude by summing up the five paradoxes I tried to bring out. So the first is the paradox that nationalist populism is a transnational phenomenon. Second, that globalization has lowered global inequality while raising domestic inequalities. Third, that during the period of globalization, poverty has declined in many contexts while inequality has increased. Fourth, that populism, which is a threat to democracy, may, under some circumstances, and certainly inadvertently, function to strengthen democracy. So we'll see what happens in the United States. We can also see the resistance movement, the Women's March, which was also transnational. These are reactions to, in this case, Trumpism, which then generated, we saw the elections a couple weeks ago in Virginia, New Jersey, other places, where there were significant gains for the groups that have been characterized by by the ethno-nationalist organizations and movements. So you never know. The reaction could end up being strong enough to tilt the balance toward democracy's health. And that would be a paradox that we might have, if democracy survives Trump, we might have him to thank for the strengthening of democracy. That's, I try to hang on to some shreds of optimism. And the final paradox is just that transnational networks, as in the tax justice movement, may play a vital role in strengthening democracy at the national scale by generating pressures to reduce inequality through the tax system. Thank you for your patience and your listening.